Only 16 days after having surgery, and it was Carlos Sainz that reigned supreme, stepping to the top spot of the podium, victorious in Australia. It was misery for Max Verstappen, ending his run of 43 consecutive race finishes, and even more misery for Mercedes, with both drivers not finishing, albeit one of them not being the driver's fault. Or maybe both, which we'll come to in a bit more detail. But let's have a look, shall we, at the result. Ferrari scored their first 1-2 since Bahrain in 2022, with the man leaving the Italian team come the end of the season, securing his third ever Formula One victory. His teammate completing the max points haul with second place and the fastest lap. Then come the two McLarens, but due to team orders and not to the delight of the home faithful in Melbourne, it was Lando Norris earning his 14th F1 career podium. Local boy Piastri coming in fourth. So far in is still no Red Bull. Well, here's one for you. A disappointing fifth for Perez, and it would have been two Aston Martins, with Alonso finishing ahead of his teammate in sixth, but due to a 20-second penalty to Alonso, he is demoted to eighth, with Stroll and Tsunoda profiting. Stroll sixth, Tsunoda seventh. Yuki Tsunoda finishing seventh equalled his best since Abu Dhabi in 2021 and scored RB's first points of the campaign. Ninth and 10th, and Haas have done it again. Hulkenberg leading the pair home. Just out of the points and perhaps reigniting the fairness debate is Alex Albon in the other guy's Williams. A quick run through the rest, and it's Daniel Ricciardo in a lowly 12th, the Alpine of Gasly followed by the two Saubers, the other Alpine in 16th, and then, three DNFs. Russell and Hamilton having a weekend to forget again. And how about this? Max Verstappen ending that 43 Grand Prix consecutive race finishes as he pulled out with just 3 laps gone. Well, to look back at the race and a whole lot more, I'm delighted to have here in the UK Alex Kalinauckas, and over there down under is Matt Q. First of all, Matt, first time you've been down under to see a Grand Prix. What was the experience like?
It's an amazing city, I have to say, very friendly, and I've got an old school chum out here, so it's been good to see them. And as you can see, I've now hopped aboard a helicopter to record this video with a beautiful skyline view of Melbourne. But yeah, it's a great place, really friendly, really enthusiastic, and this is in no way a dig at other Grand Prix, but you've got a beautiful venue right in the heart of a city, and yet there's no traffic, there's no sort of crowd control issues, everything just works. It's a bit expensive, but I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, huge fan of very, very static shots as well, but look of it, Matt. Well, it's great to see you here.
Just a little add to that is I know that to many, Albert Park is in no way like an historic venue. It's not a Monza, it's not a Monaco, but you know, the entire time I've grown up with Formula One, it's always been on the calendar bar COVID. So I come here, I think of, incidents with Villeneuve, Schumacher, Alonso flying through the air, whatever, and I actually think it's sort of really dripping in charisma, so as a fanboy it's great for that as well.
Well, that is good to hear, and I know it's your last one, so you won't go back there in the future, or maybe you will. We'll come to that at the end, I'm sure, but let's go to Alex then. So let's kick off with this Grand Prix. It was a fantastic performance from Carlos Sainz.
Certainly was. Yeah, I thought you were going to say fantastic race, Bryn, because I think actually, if we look at it objectively, really wasn't all that interesting. It was just the fact that there was so much joy in the fact that, and we say that, of course, without the accusations of bias, like we just like it when things are different, right? So when the Red Bull was out of the race, when Max Verstappen had his issue, suddenly you're like, oh my God, something's different, something's new, this is interesting, this is intriguing. But then after that, it's a tyre management affair. And I think that when you get things like, Charles Leclerc had to pit a little bit earlier, then he had that big tyre offset to Carlos Sainz, there was no contest at the front. That's not to take anything away from Carlos Sainz's performance, which, again, other than a small mistake in qualifying yesterday that isn't guaranteed to have lost in pole. I think Max Verstappen was as good as he ever is in qualifying, to secure pole position. Sainz has been pretty flawless. And then you add on top of that 2 weeks ago he was recovering, literally just out of hospital in Jeddah from having his appendix removed. So, I mean, I've got to do the drive ratings for Autosport.com and Autosport magazine this week. He's getting a 10 out of 10. The appendicitis factor mitigates against the error at the end of Q3. So, yeah, what can you say about him? I mean, he's like, what else has he got to do to get a top drive? I think if push came to shove, if you asked me, I don't recommend Ferrari ask me to be their team manager and having to make decisions. Do I want Carlos Sainz or Lewis Hamilton? I'm probably going to take Lewis Hamilton because he's a 7-time world champion. But if the other car was completely free and Carlos Sainz was up there, why wouldn't he even be in consideration? Like, think of what Mercedes have got to choose now. Maybe Red Bull and Aston Martin, things like that, if things really do change in the driver market. Honestly, like, the other drivers are being asked if he's underrated. And really, I think there's a case to be made that just circumstances, unfortunate circumstances, think Las Vegas, think that red flag here in qualifying a couple of years ago, have hurt Sainz, because he's just been fantastic this weekend.
Yeah, he really has. And actually, Matt, since you've been there, a lot of the TV reporters have been saying that when Carlos Sainz has been walking around, he's been a bit tentative. You can see he's not completely 100%. He's not been able to train properly as you'd like to and things like that. Have you noticed anything? Because when he gets in the car, he's just been a bit of an animal.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a picture surfaced of him and Norris in like the cool-down room after the race, and Carlos has lifted up his shirt, and he's still got a great big dressing across there, and it was quite funny speaking to Alex Albon about it. They're sort of having an appendicitis off of whose was worse. You know, Albon's got the respiratory failure card, but he also was like, you know, the fact that Sainz has come back in, you know, a week sooner effectively than he did to make the race has been fantastic, and then you've both got sort of the endurance, the long runs, and then also offsetting it when you're, you know, giving everything on a qualifying lap. And yeah, he has come through it spectacularly well. And sort of to pick up what Alex was saying, I think basically there are certain, you know, rumours about the Sainz's camp being a bit difficult or whatever, but I firmly believe that basically if Hamilton hadn't have been available, then Sainz would still have that Ferrari seat, because to my mind him and Leclerc are a better pairing than him or Hamilton. Hamilton's a 7-time world champion, yes, but I think there's less to dispute with a number one position, any friction, the team being built around one driver or the other, like there will be with Hamilton and Leclerc. Whereas with Sainz and Leclerc, you've got probably Leclerc who's half a tenth quicker, and Sainz who is an absolute intellect, and between them that's a really, really potent combination.
Yeah, I think you're probably onto something just there, Matt. But let's talk about the other part of the equation, the Leclerc part of the equation then, because in quali he had tyre problems, or he said he had tyre problems. In race he said he had tyre problems. Alex, what are your thoughts? Is it driver error, car setup error? What's going on there?
I think the qualifying thing in particular is just the fact that he seemed to, well, he said this outright, that he lost his feeling, his confidence with the car between FP3 and qualifying. Now, the conditions did change quite a lot. They were quite hotter for qualifying, and the wind in particular, if you go and read what the Mercedes drivers were saying about the wind, that seemed to pretty much knock their car out of the sort of sweet spot they'd arrived at with the setup. So you can understand that that's probably what's happened with Charles Leclerc in that case. Equally, the same thing would have applied to Sainz, but it just seems that Leclerc, he operates a little bit more on feel, if you know what I mean. Like, he's just so instinctively fast that it seems to have, that's what's really sort of what's done for him in qualifying. And the tyres are so sensitive. Again, look at what another driver's been saying. Nico Hülkenberg said a small mistake at turn 7, he never got the tyre temperature window back. So little things can add up to big differences, especially in such a compressed pack. Leclerc then said in qualifying, we tried to, a really aggressive change, adding a load of, turns on the front wing, and it just didn't work out for him. So that, I think, explains what happened to him in qualifying. In the race, as I've said, I think ultimately he's undone by his qualifying position in a sort of, I know we're going to get to McLaren, but a sort of similar way Lando Norris was. Like, he was just vulnerable to the undercut because he was ahead. I think the McLaren strategy thing has been massively overblown. But when it comes to Leclerc, Russell pits, Piastri pits, Leclerc pits at the same time. I think Andrea Stella said, they might have been listening to our radio calls, or, just realised that an aggressive strategy was a good idea. But ultimately what happened? They came out, they were in a bit of traffic. Leclerc had to, he was racing against, it's an Alpine, and that is pretty disparaging to Alpine, but that's the position they're in. He had to push hard on his tyres. It meant that his stint was obviously a lot harder, and Sainz had the massive tyre offset. So I think everything that happened in the race is explainable, but ultimately it all comes down to the difference in qualifying.
Carlos Sainz so far this season, a third and a first in his 2 Grand Prix. He's outperforming his teammate Leclerc, the one they've managed to retain for 2025. So this one's going to rumble on, I think, a fair bit. As may this story, it might just disappear off into the ether, who knows. And that is Max Verstappen. First time in 43 consecutive races that he's not finished, Matt. It was a brake issue. It got him pretty early on.
Yeah, it's first DNF since here 2 years ago, when they had one of those early fuel system failures that also scuppered them in Bahrain. And not to make light of the situation, but it's a proper retirement. That I enjoyed that. We had smoke, we had flames, we had car bits exploding as he came into the pit lane. A proper one.
Was George Russell's a proper retirement? For a proper retirement, then?
Yeah, there's that as well. They did well. If you weren't doing driver ratings but retirement ratings, I think they'd score highly. But with Verstappen, so a bit like the Mercedes power unit failure, there's no direct explanation. Everything's basically been put in a box and sent back to the UK for inspection. However, we don't have F1 TV anymore, which is a separate point of frustration, to look at who was ripping off tear-offs on the way to the grid that Verstappen's run over, see if he's picked anything up, like with versus Leclerc at Spa in 2022, or even Ocon stuff at this race. But I suspect, having spoken to a couple of people at the team, it might more be something as much like a bit of tape, or basically having the wrong cooling on that brake duct, rather than it necessarily have gone over a bit of debris and being blocked.
Yeah, I think also don't forget Red Bull here last year had quite significant troubles with the braking, like we saw Perez off the road in qualifying that did for his weekend 12 months ago. And so I think that, because there was that moment in the garage where Max was sort of like tapping his head and seemed very angry with one of his engineers. He's explained that away as the fact that they did a pit stop, and that he was like, well, I'm obviously going to retire, why are you doing a pit stop? But again, I think Matt's onto something. Red Bull struggles here. It's not, it struggles with the tyres. It clearly struggles with the braking. And as we saw with Ferrari in Bahrain, it's all about the cooling. They can put the bigger brake ducts on. They can tape bits up. You want to make your brakes as aerodynamic as you possibly can. If you get it slightly wrong, it can have big consequences. Obviously, we don't have confirmation of that, but it tracks, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess it does. Now, the one driver that didn't seem to have any problems out there, and yet seemed to have problems out there, is the other Red Bull driver, Perez. He came home way out of position when you think his main job really is to pick up wins when Max doesn't. It was wide of the mark.
Yeah, there was sort of a line I saw getting pedalling around from Horner, I think, in defence of Perez, that he had a bit of damage. I've not seen an awful lot to support that, but I think you can sort of rush to Perez's aid in some respects. Okay, he completely undid his weekend from very early on in Q1 by blocking Hulkenberg. That was a stupid mistake. Okay, the team should have warned him better, but he should have not been in that place at that time, and immediately had a 3-second penalty. Again, a mark against him is that even with that, he should have been the second fastest. Verstappen put it on pole. He should have been second to sort of minimise the damage of that penalty. However, speaking to a couple of team bosses, the Red Bull data on the long runs wasn't that good in the race. They think there would have been a proper dice between the Ferraris and Verstappen, sort of on merit, without the brake problems, particularly with sort of the way graining came into it. So it's that balance of how much is Perez sort of not doing what was required, and there's, I'm afraid to say, not flippantly, there's always an element of that, or it seems to be that way. So long, but I don't think this was Red Bull's strongest race. Not in the sense that, we've come to a street track, so they've got to raise a ride height like you get at Singapore, and that puts them massively out the window. It's more to do with the interactions with the tyre this weekend.
I can't, just sort of expanding on that, Matt. I actually think Max Verstappen still might have won this race. That's just my initial feeling. I'll get to that. I can expand on your Horner line as well. He said that actually when they looked at the car, they discovered, he pretty much outright names it, a Fernando Alonso visor tear off, stuck in the floor that was costing about 20 downforce points. So
that's 2 people he's taken out.
Yeah, exactly. Very crafty from Fernando. But yeah, I mean, that I think basically what that does by Perez, clearly there was obviously something, because he was coming through the field. He was quick in the early stages, and then it all seems to disappear, particularly towards the end of the stint, the first stint on the hard tyres, and then later on to the second stint on the hards. But basically, we don't have enough data to say that Red Bull definitely would have been defeated. Like Perez, yeah, absolutely. Even if Max had been in this race, he would have been beaten. I'm sorry, Sergio, but Max has got one of his brakes locked on, put a handbrake on the car, and he was still within DRS and within half a second behind Carlos Sainz, okay, albeit for a lap, but it's not like he suddenly tumbled away. He was still, potentially in the position to come back at him. How that would have worked out at a longer stint, I don't know, but I just think that to how compromised Red Bull ended up being, I don't think you can comprehensively say that they definitely would have lost this race.
With that point in mind that you've both really been making, Had Max stayed in the race, would we still be talking about a Ferrari win? I've heard from Alex. What do you think?
It's difficult to say. I really enjoyed the fact that we actually had an on-track overtake for the lead, but as the Red Bull camper at pains to say, it wasn't really meritocratic because he had a difficult feeling in the car, feeling that the handbrake was on from the formation lap. So that obviously allows Sainz to come through. So if you've already got that offsetting them, then perhaps without that, does Verstappen streak into a lead? We've got not to disappear off a tangent, but for this year, we've got, the change in the DRS rule, so it's now activated at the end of lap 1, at the end of lap 3. The idea is that, you can be within a DRS zone of Max Verstappen immediately and then chase after him, so he's not had that cushion to sort of lean on his tyres. But because of the thermal or the tyre warm-up issues here and the graining, which meant the tyres were ripping, drivers were immediately backing off anyway, sort of bring in the tyres gently. So that meant they were processional and then weren't able to capitalise on that DRS effect anyway, that it being introduced earlier. So I don't think Sainz necessarily would have been in the 1 second window to mount an early overtake on Verstappen if he doesn't have a catastrophic brake failure. So thereafter, I'm not too convinced, just because of sort of that plane Verstappen is operating in. So the pessimist in me says Verstappen probably has it on a good day.
It sounds like in the background, Matt, that maybe Perez is banging his head against a wall or something like that. It's very loud going on just there. But let's move to a team that did have a very good day, and that is McLaren. Both their drivers, 3rd and 4th. It sounded like there was a few boos going on, though, when the team orders came in and Piastri had to move aside for Norris. But, Matt, you being there, do you think it was the right call? It seems to have been, with retrospect, looking back. Yeah,
neither of the drivers are fussed about it, and I can keep it brief for you, really, is that Andrea Stella, when he was sort of justifying the decision, do strategists ever care about the home fans and all of that? He said it wasn't even a strategic decision, it was an executional decision, is the word he liked. I really like that. So it wasn't swapping positions so that Norris could go after Leclerc, or it wasn't swapping positions so Leclerc could go ahead of Norris to then have a buffer to Perez. It was just so that Norris was the faster car at that point. He would have to overtake Piastri, so why not do it in controlled conditions, take away that element of risk and orchestrate it? So it wasn't about changing positions beyond the McLaren camp, if you see what I mean. It was just to make it as smooth as possible.
Aptly put. I mean, it's nice you're talking about that sort of thing. There's loads of banging on. I've no idea what's going on just out of shot, by the way.
I think the ignoring of the media centre shuts when the last journalist leaves. It's pack it all down now.
Right, okay, simple as that. It does sound like there's a lot going on, which is quite exciting. It's just we can't see what it is, unfortunately. But let's move on very quickly to Aston Martin. We haven't really touched upon Aston Martin or Mercedes, and these two kind of are intrinsically linked with one of the Mercedes drivers. It looked like it was a pretty good afternoon for Alonso and for Lance Stroll, but Alonso's been given a penalty. Alex, talk us through what happened with Aston Martin, and then we'll move it on to Mercedes.
Yeah, so the main thing about, I'll be honest, I don't actually really know what happened with Lance Stroll. He just sort of seemed to pretty much be there backing up Alonso. Fair enough. Like, finally did a weekend where things went sort of smooth enough for Lance Stroll. But the reason why, because obviously he started ahead of him, the reason why Alonso got ahead was because he started on the hard tyres, and that made the critical difference, because obviously when you get that virtual safety car, when Lewis Hamilton retires, he was able to gain about 10, 11 seconds of race time. So he was sort of vaulted ahead, including of George Russell. Aston Martin then, I thought, made a very smart call, actually went quite aggressive with the second stop, which again, the undercut effect is so powerful. We sort of touched on that with the McLaren drivers, that kept him ahead of the Mercedes, which I think we know it is. It's a faster car, especially when they get it in the sweet spot and things like that. And Russell was homing in on him. He had a tyre life advantage at the end of the race and was within half a second for the last few laps of the race, and then basically it's all got very murky. It's all got very crafty Fernando Alonso, but sort of has a bit of almost a nasty element to it when you sort of see the accusations that are flying around. Essentially, last lap of the race, Alonso brakes a little bit earlier for turn 6, Russell suddenly arrives, loses the downforce, can't control the car, goes wide, hits the wall, has a very unfortunately massive accident. He's trapped in the middle of the track. I think the FIA has quite a lot to answer for why they didn't immediately red flag it or virtual safety car it or something. There's a horrible video of George Russell on the radio basically screaming, red flag, red flag, red flag, I'm in the middle of the track. Still nothing happens for several seconds. Lance Stroll actually comes past George Russell's wreckage before the VSC very slowly and very safely, and well done Lance for that. But yeah, just on the Alonso incident, Mercedes were all over this immediately. Like, you can see the GPS traces. It's quite clear what Alonso does. He does brake earlier. He then gets back on the throttle. Then he brakes for the corner and then he carries on. And all of that, that's what, it catches out Russell. There's a little bit on Russell. I think you would expect someone to be able to try and mitigate that a little bit, but definitely he was obviously caught out. So it's gone up to the stewards, and the stewards have said, look, actually what we're going to do is we're going to take the crash out of it. We're just going to assess, did Fernando Alonso do anything different that might be, deemed to be erratic or dangerous per the wording of the regulations? And ultimately, that's what they found they did. Now, Alonso was claiming that he was having battery deployment problems, that he thought he'd brake a little bit earlier to get a better line out. It's a long blast out from there to turn 9. It all makes logical sense. I think we think back to Brazil last year and his amazing defence against Sergio Perez. What happened there? He varied his lines. He varied his braking, his things like that. These are legitimate tactics, but per Fernando's own words, he got it wrong. So basically Mercedes have gone, well, you braked, then you got back on the throttle. This must be something really not right. And he's gone, yeah, I tried to change my line. I just messed it up. Now, there's no sort of, there's no firm conclusion that this was a brake test. So we have to take Fernando at his word. But even at his word, that's pretty poor. Like, he tried to do something clever and he messed it up. And now he's copped a penalty. He's tumbled down the order. And yeah, a pretty shocking end to the race. And I think if you go back and look at the interviews Alonso gave afterwards, he wasn't that uber cool, sort of crafty, as I said, sort of cunning, clever, at ease with everything Fernando. He was bit rabbit in the headlights. Something's gone wrong here. So yeah, I think that's all. That pretty much sums it up, I hope. But yeah, not the end to the race anybody ideally wants.
Yeah, not the ending that anybody wants, and certainly not the ending that Mercedes wanted from this weekend either, because Russell was going to be in the points. He's not in the points. He finishes outside the points, as does Lewis Hamilton, as we say. He had to pull over on lap 11, bringing out that virtual safety car. So it's all going wrong for Mercedes, Matt, and presumably they're starting to get a bit worried now.
Yeah, it's bad, isn't it? So this race last year, Mercedes initially led 1-2. Okay, they didn't convert it, but they've watched in a year Ferrari come from behind to lead by 40 seconds before Russell's wipeout. McLaren have come from being, okay, they weren't the worst, but they were in 10th place in the Constructors' Championship, to coming past and slotting them back. And the whole point of this car, moving away from one concept to the other, was not to go and win world championships, but it was to have a consistent platform. And yet they're still having massive inconsistencies, massive peaks and troughs. So it's not solved that basic thing. Just nothing from the team is inspiring, I'm afraid. Like, they can put a positive spin on a disaster. Well done, everyone back at the factory, work hard. But the tone is really bad. It's very, very tough. That they have a fundamental problem with correlating the wind tunnel with the on-track data. But Aston Martin use the same rear end, the same wind tunnel until they move. And yet, okay, this season, they haven't taken a huge stride forward, but they are at least consistent in a way Mercedes aren't. They're saying they have a physics problem. Well, the laws of physics, not to be too flippant, haven't changed. Mercedes are getting it wrong. I think it's really quite worrying, in a sense that this is not in any way to sort of trivialise the Constructors' World Championships they've won, but the previous generation of cars did fundamentally respond well to having downforce bolted on. Ground effects, whether it's a more holistic package, more nuanced, they seem to really be struggling to get their head around it. They've had a change of technical structure. That's not brought the rewards. They've tried to solve the rear end stability. They also had a problem with the gearbox casing stiffness. They fixed that for this year. They've repositioned the cockpit to suit Hamilton's demands. We know that. They fixed that for this year. And yet the car is not only still lacking pace, but as we saw throughout practice, and Hamilton doing an early 2022 spec wild setup to try and find something it responds to, it's just not doing. Today in a media session, Wolff is not doing this is the worst weekend I've ever had in F1 like he did repeatedly throughout last year, because I think fundamentally he's a bit drained. He's not playing into that hyperbole, because there's the impression that there's quite a few worse weekends to come. And I don't do all the races. We have quite a good rotation at Autosport, bit work-life balance, try to in theory anyway, but it's the first post-race Wolff session I've had where people are going, are you still the right man for the job? And Wolff is going, I'm open to ideas. I don't think that's in a sense of, if you can name a successor, then appoint one, but it's just that they're looking for areas to find the performance, and they're not bringing it. Okay, Wolff isn't going to be like sacked or anything. It's a bit more nuanced and complicated because he is a shareholder, but it seems like he's not only feeling the pressure, but there's a lot of outside coming on. He's saying, you almost wouldn't blame Lewis Hamilton for looking over the fence, because the next team he's going to has made a massive improvement and they're not. And I think the logical sort of conclusion is that they don't get this fixed for next year either. So they're pinning their hopes on 2026, when engine change, it may all well come good. But this is a disaster. And just worst of all is that they're not going, okay, the next point is this, we focus on all this. They don't have an understanding. They don't have a grasp of the problem. I know I've gone on a bit there, but to throw forward to the podcast, we'll do a bit more on this and go in a bit more detail. But I think it's really, really bleak.
Yeah, and I think that Lewis Hamilton, looking at this, he'll think, well, Ferrari's trajectory is definitely an upward one, and Mercedes look like it's going down, and that could obviously be why he decided at that moment to jump ship and move on to Ferrari as well. So it is a concern.
Has he, for the second time in his career, sort of gone left when everyone thought he should have gone right? The whole going from McLaren to Mercedes, not many anticipated that would pay off so handsomely. We're starting to look like that a Ferrari move could be another brilliant decision.
And they make their own engines as well, so who's to say their 2026 engine isn't going to be the absolute class of the field?
Yeah.
Well, listen, I'm going to rattle through the rest of the teams, guys. So here we go. I'm going to start with you, Alex. We're going to just touch on each one as quickly as we can, but give them a bit of a mention. And I think one person that needs a really good mention is Yuki Tsunoda, who's performing really well for RB, and Daniel Ricciardo, who's, not.
Yeah, yes, that very much sums it up, Bryn. Very succinct. I've done a bit of live research, and I do know what happened to Lance Stroll in this race, and it pretty much concerns Yuki Tsunoda. He jumped ahead of him at the start, and Tsunoda chased him all race, all through the pit stops, and ended up coming behind him. Massive gainer from Alonso's penalty. But I think the really impressive thing, I think that Red Bull and Helmut Marko wanted to see was great qualifying pace, Yuki. You've got to show something in the race that you can bring home points, and especially on a day when the bigger teams are dropping points, you've got to cash in, and he absolutely did that. So fair play to him. Again, is he in contention for a Red Bull seat? The chat just isn't there. If their whole junior team thing is about promoting people, then he should be. But yet the chat is now Christian Horner saying we wouldn't rule out Carlos Sainz on coming back to the Red Bull camp and racing alongside Verstappen next year on performance grounds. So what more can Tsunoda do? He does have, of course, those close links with Honda, and obviously they're going to Aston Martin in 2026. But as you said, Bryn, there's not really a lot to add with Ricciardo. It's just not happening for him. Which
means for him, Matt, Ricciardo and his eyeing up the Red Bull seat that may or may not be free, he's got to do something, and he's got to do it quickly.
Absolutely. I asked Yuki sort of, what's your end goal here? Are you getting the Red Bull seat, or are you basically stopping Ricciardo? Because, like I say, he's not been linked. And with Ricciardo, okay, this sample size for this year is small so far. I'm looking at a couple of my colleagues in the Australian colleagues in the media centre, carefully listening to what I'm about to say next to about him. They're making eye contact. But it's not even as if you can attribute it almost, I don't think, to the regulation change. You know how his compatriot Mark Webber was fundamentally undone by the Pirelli tyres. He struggled with the 2021 car at McLaren, he struggled with the 2022 car at McLaren, and now this car. So what is that? Is that a fundamental inability to drive around problems? And I have to say, there does seem to be a bit of excuse searching, whether that's basically his camp corralling him and telling him, oh, it's not you, or whatever. But so we've got those 3 cars he struggled in, but this thing where over here, from everything we heard by all accounts, he absolutely wowed Red Bull in the test. So did he wow them, or did he compare favourably against Perez rather than being just half a tenth off Verstappen? And how much do you then, with a bit of revisionism, look and go, well, those mega days at Silverstone where he was close in benchmark times, slightly different conditions, slightly more favourable conditions, whatever, because you've got on the one side Red Bull going, this could be the number 2 guy we need, the teammate to Max Verstappen, but what we're seeing on track, apart from Mexico and a sturdy sort of comeback in Hungary, really, really bleak.
Yeah, it's not a great picture, is it, that's being painted at the moment by Daniel Ricciardo, and it's certainly not inspiring many people around. Let's move it on to other teams though. Haas, well, you know what, they may have benefited from the 2 Mercedes not finishing and the Red Bull of Max Verstappen, but both drivers in the points, Alex.
Yeah, obviously Kevin Magnussen capitalising with Fernando Alonso and the George Russell incident, but yeah, I mean, magnificent. I mean, what I think the big thing about Haas is that basically they were deliberately underplaying things. I mean, there's no getting away from it. They were outright saying at one point, so we're still going to be last in Bahrain. Then they got to the test, they worked, all they did was concentrate on making their car better in races, and lo and behold, the work that they put in last year, that extra effort in the testing, it seems to have paid off. They really do have a car they can race with. And also, I know that Komatsu wasn't happy with one of the pit stops and sort of the strategy around that and things that went wrong there, but fundamentally they're strategically sharp. Like, there was a team order swap, it got enacted, it seemed to pay off for both drivers. And again, obviously we saw what happened in Jeddah. Kevin Magnussen, the dodgy driving aside, that strategy and the way Magnussen executed it in holding up the pack was superb. So it's all looking up for Haas, really. I mean, the problem is that Gene Haas wants wins, and that's still out of reach. But at least the progress is positive.
Yeah, another positive one. Is it a positive one? Albon. Let's look at him very quickly. Albon, he had to step into his teammate's car essentially after he messed his one up. They were trying to get points. He didn't get any points. He finished just outside the points there. So does that mean that they were wrong to let Albon have a go? If you're Sargeant, what are you thinking right now, Matt? Are you reconsidering your thoughts, your dreams when it comes to Formula One? Where do you go from here?
Well, if you're Sargeant, as harsh as it sounds, you don't dream too far ahead, because he only got the seat this year by the skin of his teeth, and basically because there were no materially better options available on the market. As for the decision Williams has made, okay, it might not be popular, but it's absolutely the right decision. When you've got such a big performance gap between your 2 drivers, it's not Piastri versus Norris. There's a gulf between Albon and Sargeant, let's get that clear. And when it's critical, the top 5 teams, if they all finish, they lock out the top 10. Well, you've had 3 drivers in the top 10 not finish here, and Williams haven't scored a point. But when you need to offset those, or basically get a point against the odds, you need the standout driver in there, no questions asked. So yes, Albon should have been in that car, but he was reporting the same sort of handling deficiencies, bad car habits this weekend as Sargeant was when he was in his. So it's just sort of a Williams limited weekend. And okay, the fact that Williams haven't come away with a point, they can't go away with heroes saying, we were entirely vindicated, but absolutely it was the right decision.
It's a hard one, isn't it? Because you feel for Logan Sargeant, but from a team point of view, with points being so important nowadays, you can see why Williams made that decision. Alex, let's just finish off with the final 2 teams, Alpine and Sauber, who've got another penalty, a fine, haven't they, because of their wheel nut issues.
Yeah, obviously they were adjusting their pit stop procedures because of the tech, the equipment that they've got this year is going so wrong in the opening 2 rounds, stacking their wheel nuts in the pit lane, losing one into the fast lane, and that's ultimately what copped them their fine. It was, however, that was the one pit stop that did seem to go right. You had a Valtteri Bottas pit stop at the start that was a total disaster, and there was a Joe Guan Yu one at the end that was also slow. That one, however, was to do with the fact that he had a gearbox problem. He couldn't select the gear to get out of the pit box. Basically, it wasn't actually, for once, the pit equipment failing Sauber. But yeah, I mean, it's really poor. It's really sloppy. It's the sort of thing that when that team is Audi, you're going to say, how on earth can you be making that mistake with the level of resources you've got that you're not necessarily investing into the car, things like that. But yeah, disastrous from Sauber. Alpine, things actually looked a little bit better. You got Esteban Ocon out of Q2. Okay, helped a little bit. Daniel Ricciardo not in the fight, things like that. There were problems elsewhere, but that seemed like positive progress. And Pierre Gasly as well. Gasly sort of with him this season, obviously his car's bad, but it's like, it's never, you know, when it rains, it pours, whatever the cliche is. Twice he's gone over the pit lane exit line. In qualifying, gets a reprimand for doing it, and in the race, there's a 5-second penalty. And I was really confused. Maybe I can clear something up for some people if they were equally confused, because I definitely saw Lando Norris go over the line, Charles Leclerc, George Russell. I'm fairly sure Perez did it as well. But actually, this is one of those really weird tracks, I think might even be the only one, where the solid line, it's a yellow line here, the solid line ends at the safety car 2 line, which is just under that bridge. After that, there is a dotted line that appears from the camera at the back to still be a solid line. It's not, it's dotted. The other drivers were cutting across that. Gasly was going to do that, did it too early, copped a silly penalty. So yeah, again, it's just like, when can Alpine catch a break is sort of their vibe leaving this weekend as well.
And it's not like Gasly hasn't got the experience to know better either now. So naughty slap on the wrist for him. Don't do it again. Well, let's have a look at the points then, shall we? As it all stands after 3 rounds after this Australian Grand Prix. And it is Max Verstappen leading the way, even though he has that retirement. He sits on 51 points. Then Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari is second on 47. Sergio Perez in third, so not a disaster for him, on 46, just behind. And then Carlos Sainz on 40, so very tight at the top. Then a big jump down to Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris, and a bit of a jump again between the next ones running down the list with George Russell and Fernando Alonso. Good to see Oliver Behrman still there on 6 points. He's still in the ranking, still doing quite well in the ranking, even though he's only going to race once this season, you would imagine. But there you go, that's the drivers' standings. What about the teams, the constructors? Well, Red Bull lead the way on 97, not far behind though. Ferrari just 4 back on 93. Then a big jump to McLaren on 55. And who's the 4th best team? Is it Mercedes or is it Aston Martin? We just don't know, but we're going to have to wait and see. But that is it for our coverage from the Australian Grand Prix. Before we go, though, I mentioned it, I'm sure, at one point here, that it is Matt's final one. He's disappearing off. He's leaving us for pastures new and a fresh challenge. So we thought, in time-honoured tradition, that we should look back at Matt's highlights. Right, there you go. That was your highlight there, Matt. Any final thoughts?
It's been an absolute privilege working for Autosport, and thank you very much to all the viewers, listeners, readers for bearing with me. And I'll now sort of be one of them. I'll be watching all of these videos, listening to all the podcasts, reading all the articles. So keep up the good work, everybody else.
And you know just how it gets put together. Matt, thank you very much indeed. We wish you all the very best with your fresh challenge as well. And thanks to you too, Alex.
Cheers.
Well, there you go. That's the end of our coverage, our race review for Australia. Don't forget, 2 weeks before the Grand Prix train chuffs on to Japan for a slightly less early start for us here in Western Europe, but still early enough. Don't forget, you can catch all the news, all the updates as they happen by subscribing and liking all the videos here at Autosport. Just give us a subscribe and we'll keep you up to date. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.